I'm Ken Blackwell. Good afternoon. I'm a member of the CNP Action Board of Directors. Welcome to our CNP Action Incorporated How to Preserve the Electoral College and Voter Integrity Action Session. Before we begin, I'm to read the CNP Action Incorporated disclaimer. Here we go. This session is sponsored by CNP Action Incorporated, the 501c4 sister organization of the Council for National Policy. CNP Action Incorporated serves as an advocate for conservative principles such as limited government, the promotion of free economic enterprise, traditional values, and a strong national defense. CNP Action Incorporated does not support candidates or political parties, but it may promote issues or specific pieces of legislation. Contributions to CNP Action Incorporated are not tax deductible as charitable contributions. For more information on CNP Action Incorporated and how you can support our efforts, please review the information in your meeting packet. Thanks to those of you who have donated to CNP Action in the past, and we look forward to new contributors. Since our last meeting in October, we have seen a growth in contributors to CNP Action, and we hope that continues. Also in your packet is the Rules for Engagement document. Please familiarize yourself with this document. If you have a comment, question, please try to keep it concise. 1 minute. The goal of CNP's action session is to strategize on a given issue and to arrive at a unified path of action to be taken by all present in an effort to maximize our impact. When there is only 15 minutes left in this action session, a loud buzzer will sound, which means it's time to focus on creating a final list of action steps. You will be instructed to go to a website and vote for your top 3 action steps. Now let me briefly introduce our stellar panel. In the order that they will speak, Catherine Eengelbrecht. Catherine in 2009 founded the True the Vote to restore integrity to our electoral system. True the Vote recruits, trains, and mobilizes citizens to work in elections, election research data, and advocate for election code reform. True to Vote is one of the nation's leading voter rights organizations, and Catherine and I have worked together over a number of years to promote election integrity. Hans von Spakovsky. Hans is a senior legal fellow and manager of the Election Law Reform Initiative in the Mies Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation. In 2006 and 2007, Hans served as a commissioner for the Federal Election Commission. For 2002 to 2005, he served at the United States Department of Justice, including as counsel to the Assistant Secretary General for Civil Rights. Trent Eagle, who you heard in the general session. Trent England is the Executive Vice President and the David and Ann Brown Distinguished Fellow at the Oklahoma Council for Public Affairs. Brad Smith, who you heard in the general session. Brad is the founder and chairman of the board of the the Institute for Free Speech, and is a distinguished professor of law at Capital University Law School. He has served on the Federal Elections Commission under George W. Bush, and is the author of 3 books on election law and numerous articles and book chapters on that same subject. Let me give special thanks to Bill Dallas and United in Purpose for providing note takers for the CNP Action Inc. Action session. Thank you, Anna, for being our taker of notes, and we can begin this session. The next 8 months will be very, very important to the nature and the integrity of our constitutional republic. Those who would move us towards socialism would also like to destroy our electoral college system, which provides for a delicate balance that guarantees that all states are important and no states can be deemed flyover country. It also protects minorities in the context of American democracy. One of the surest ways to accelerate the move towards socialism is to, in fact, destroy the Constitution and move us towards majority means right. And as a consequence, what we will see is a destruction of our individual liberties and the furtherance of a concentration of power in the central government. Whether you call it the expansion of the welfare state, the socialist system, the reality is that what we lose are individual liberties, and what we gain is a suffocating big government infrastructure and bureaucracy that serves the interests, as history has taught us, to a very tiny handful of people. With that being said, Catherine, you start us off, please.
All right, great. Well, thank you, Ken, and thank you to CNP Action, and thank you to everybody who is here with us for this next hour and a half. When I started True the Vote in 2009, I started sort of quite by accident, thinking that we could go and work in the polls, find problems, solve those problems. It would be easy. It would be something that we could all get along about. There shouldn't be a party divide. This should be an issue that should unite all sides. And I learned very quickly that that was not, in fact, the case. This is an absolute frontline fight that happens now. It seems around every corner you find a new way to cheat this process, and I've outlined a few of them up on the screen. What it took me a few years to learn, and what I hope all of us here are coming to grips with, because we need to, there's nothing that our adversaries won't do. There is no ground to which they will not stoop. There is no angle which they will not play. They will do anything. If we leave something exposed, it will be taken. Civility has left the building. They are playing for keeps. So how does that actually play out? Well, mob rule, first of all. The swarming tactics of a radicalized socialist mindset is a dangerous thing to behold. What we have seen, though, past that, is the organized mob chaos. When in doubt, I say oftentimes to my team, when in doubt, they will just cause chaos. It is fascinating when you look through the last 30, 40 years of election history, how often things just disintegrate. They get set on fire. Mob rule overwhelms the clarity around the issue. And one thing about election integrity is that it's so granular, it's so precise, that they take advantage of that moment, that stutter step that we take in the preservation of rule of law, and just roll right over it. So we've got to be prepared en masse, I believe, to have that all hands on deck sentinel impact of being engaged in the process to counteract what I believe is going to be the largest of the mobs that we've ever seen coming up this November. Playing on down that line, you go through, and we'll go through them quickly, but you have the abandonment then of law and order. It's something that we oftentimes see with volunteers who have been trained in what they are expected to behold inside of the polls, and when that doesn't happen and they call attention to it, it's over. It's like I liken it to sort of harvesting fog. You see things that happen, you don't know what to do, you don't have backup, you don't know quite who to tell, and it's over. That is made all the more true by the fact that so many of these loopholes have now been institutionalized as part of our process. Same-day registration is an example of this. For any of you that live in a state with same-day registration, you can walk in, register, and vote in one fell swoop. There's no way to authenticate. Not that there's not technology that exists to authenticate, because there certainly is, but that's not the process, and there's no way to catch that. Ballot harvesting here in California is another great example of just the sheer, words fail, the notion that ballot harvesting would be legal, but yet it is. And so there's very little you can do, because it's, unless you change the law, so you've got to get ahead of it in the session to push that down so that it impacts 2020. It's not going to happen this November. So we have to deal with what is. Going on down, you're going to see procedural failures, technology subversions, mail-in ballot fraud, ballot harvesting, ineligible voter fraud, impersonation fraud, and there are all kinds of variants, all sorts of shades of gray in between all of those. But there's a lot going on. It's like death by duck bites. You don't need a whole lot. You just need a little bit in the right places. And oftentimes it's a function of, watch what this hand is doing while we're pushing in just what we need over on the other side. The best way, we think, to counteract that is to translate that passion into action by working inside of the process, by actually rolling up our sleeves and serving. I know it feels great to go and vote and get that I voted sticker and feel like, man, I did my bit. My friends, it is not enough this year. And you lucky ladies and gentlemen happen to pick a session where I will tell you, you've now been called. You can never say that nobody invited you to go and work in the polls and didn't tell you it's essential. We don't have near the number of volunteers that we should. What happens inside of a state when you don't have enough volunteers over time, they say, forget about it, we're just going to go to all mail-in. And the step past that, forget about it, we'll just do it all online. You can't unring that bell, you can't get that back. Once it's gone that far, those checks and balances, as thin as they are gone entirely. We have got to show up and work in the polls. And that's what True the Vote is focusing on. That is our lane. Micro-organizing, we're focusing on those 13 key states with force-multiplying partnerships. The ladies on the front row, Ruth Weiss, Linda Payne, do amazing work here in California with Election Integrity Project California. They've got it going on in the state. We just want to help amplify their message. That's what we hope to do in ways large and small across the country. Researching, reporting, and mobilizing. We have an app that's called Ground that is useful for organizing, and so we're focusing efforts there. Recruiting and training election integrity teams and individuals. Of interest here, we have a new initiative called Continue to Serve, which is about recruiting veterans and first responders to work inside the polls. You want to talk about people who understand and respect law and order and chain of command. You get some SEALs in those polls. And they're going to say, no, this is what it says, and this is how we're going to play this show. And that's what we need. We need people who are unafraid to call it like they see it all the way down the line. And that line is long because it's not just election day. It's early election, it's mail-in ballot, it's central count. There are so many places that citizens can be involved. In fact, in most states, it's very clear that citizens can be involved everywhere that ballots are, everywhere that the equipment is. You can be there for the calibration ceremonies when you want to, if you want to see how they are making sure that the election equipment is up to snuff. There's so many ways that citizens can be involved. But for so long, we've just thought, government has it under control. They don't. It's us. We're supposed to run elections. We've just forgotten that somewhere along the way. It's time to remember. It's time to get back involved. And then the macro messaging. I submitted the slide deck, and then at a couple hours ago, I asked the folks if I could add a term in here because it is appropriate, and it's not always in this slide deck. But our macro messaging is going to include social media, clearly, videos, YouTubes, podcasts, but intercessory prayer. My friends, this is, we've got to focus on all fronts because it's going to take us all. And so that's what we're doing. And why? Because we are fighting for the soul of our country. If you know anything about True the Vote or my story, you may have heard that we were in this sort of epic battle with the IRS that lasted for a number of years. And when we finally won this past summer, I have to tell you, I feel like I had been gut punched for several years in a row, and I didn't know if this was where I should be any longer. Nobody has the luxury of that kind of option right now. If you love this country, you've got to stay engaged. We're battle hardened, Mercy knows, and we're ready to go, but we can only win this if we work together. And so many of the talks that are happening this weekend center around the election. It is my prayer that outside of this, we all find a way to come together and be force multipliers for one another, because we've got to stick together. There are hundreds of radicalized groups out there that serve to undo everything that we try to do. We've got to stick together. We've got to have the sentinel effect of letting those who would subvert our process know that we're watching, because observation changes things and engagement changes things. So that's what we have going on, and I think it is the best way to secure all borders, and that's what True the Vote's up to. Hans?
Thanks. I'm Hans von Spakovsky. I work at the Heritage Foundation, as you heard. I've been working in the trenches on election integrity now for a very, very long time. In fact, I first met Ken Blackwell almost 20 years ago when I was at the Department of Justice. And boy, if you think there's a swamp there now, it was like being in trench warfare when I got there as one of the lone conservatives in the Civil Rights Division. What I'm going to do is talk about the specific things that are being done by the left to try to destroy election integrity and make it worse. And this is the key. It could really make a difference in close elections. You know, if you have an election in a state for Congress and a local election where there's a huge margin of victory, then it's tough to steal that election. But we have close elections all the time in this country. Just a couple of years ago, the Secretary of State of Ohio actually put out a press release on this and summarized that in the prior 3 years, there had been over 140 elections in Ohio decided by either a tie vote or one vote. And that happens all the time in this country. I would remind you that in 2017 in Virginia, control of the state house came down to one state legislative district, and it was a tie vote. And the only reasons the Republicans retained control was because local election officials put two names in a crystal bowl and they pulled out the Republican's name. What's interesting about that one particular district is that's one of the districts in which another organization that I'm associated with, we had discovered that that one district had not too long ago removed 200 aliens from the voter rolls. These were aliens who themselves had approached election officials and said, oops, I shouldn't be registered, take me off the rolls. They probably were applying, these were legal citizens. They were probably applying for citizenship and realized they better clean this up. But these were people who, on their own, contacted election officials. We don't know how many aliens are still in the rolls there. So that tells you, and it's just another case of showing you, close elections is where it can really make a difference. We've got a database of almost 1,300 proven voter fraud cases. The left, which before our database, and particularly folks like the Washington Post and New York Times would say, oh, there's no voter fraud in the country, now switched to saying, well, because of the database, well, there is fraud, but it's not enough to worry about. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, because a lot of it doesn't get detected, and even when it does get detected, it often doesn't get prosecuted. And I could give you example of case after case after case that I know about that nobody bothered prosecuting. This is what we need. And what I would remind all of you is that most state legislatures are only in session for the first 3 or 4 months of the year. So we're in the middle of that right now. There's a couple of states that have year-round state legislatures, but most states don't, thank goodness. You, wherever you live, You should be talking to your state legislators and making sure that if you don't have these provisions in your state, you need to be talking to them, make sure they do it. We need photo ID. You need government-issued photo ID, not just for in-person voting, but for absentee balloting too. Even in states that have been smart, like Georgia, which put in one of the first government-issued photo ID laws, they left out absentee balloting. And absentee balloting is where a lot of fraud occurs. Some states have been very smart and have done it, like Kansas, Alabama, Wisconsin. ID applies to both, but that's something needed. Proof of citizenship to register to vote. We have a major problem with aliens registering and voting all over the country and getting away with it and not being detected, and even when it's detected, not being prosecuted. Every state should be using jury information to take people off the voter rolls and prosecute aliens who are registering and voting, because when you're called for jury duty, and most states use voter registration lists, I can tell you people are excused all the time because they swear under oath, I'm not a U.S. citizen. And nothing is done about that. Your state needs to be participating in the Interstate Cross-Check Program. This is a program started by Kansas and Missouri. It's a program where every state that is a member once a year, they send their statewide list to Kansas and they do a data comparison, and the state gets back a list. Here are all the names of all the people in your state who are also registered in other states. And the left is so upset about this, they have been suing states to get them out of this program. Indiana being an example of a state they sued because they don't want states finding out about this. You need to check with county election officials where you live and make sure, are they actually regularly cleaning up their voter rolls? How often do they check the statewide death list, vital records? How often do they check with the U.S. Postal Service's National Change of Address System to find people who've moved? If you think this can't make a difference, do a Google search for Wendy Rosen, who was the Democratic congressional candidate in 2012 in Maryland and was going to be challenging a Republican incumbent until someone in her own party did some opposition research on her and discovered that she was registered to vote in Maryland, had been voting in Maryland where she's running for Congress, but she'd also been registered to vote in Florida and had been voted in Florida in multiple elections at the same time she was voting in Maryland. Now, the point of that story is Maryland doesn't do anything to try to find people who are registered in multiple states, and she could have gotten away with that, could have gotten elected to Congress, except she decided to run for office and someone did opposition research on her. No election official discovered it. So you need to be sure your state is doing this. And, you know, is your state, is your county, are they regularly checking with the Social Security Administration, their master death index? There's all these things they ought to be doing, which is easy to find out. And if you want more info on that, you can go to the Heritage website where I've written about all of these issues. And I'm running out of time. You need to understand that we are in a heck of a fight, and we are outspent and out-resourced. There are just a handful of organizations on our side, the Heritage Foundation, True the Vote, Public Interest Legal Foundation, Save Our States. The other side has, this is just a short list on the right. These are all the organizations we constantly fight in court on these issues. And all those foundations on the left pour huge amounts of money into it, something like $60 million a year, to fight against any efforts on election integrity. Here is all the things that the left is pushing in your state legislatures, and they're unfortunately being successful in a lot of them. They're trying to get every state to put in automatic voter registration. That is a real problem because in states like California, where we are, and they give driver's licenses to illegal aliens, guess what? They're getting registered to vote. Illinois passed a provision like this. They just put it in, and about a month ago, they had to admit that they had mistakenly registered over 500 aliens. They had then 2 weeks later had to admit they had mistakenly registered to vote 16 and 17-year-olds who had gone in to get their driver's licenses. Okay? All-mail voting is a recipe for fraud because all-mail voting, that's absentee balloting. It's the tool of choice of election officials. You know about vote harvesting. Does everybody know what vote harvesting means? Okay. In states like North Carolina, you can either hand deliver your absentee ballot, you can mail it in, or a member of your family can deliver it for you. But in states that have legalized vote harvesting like California, anybody can pick up your absentee ballot and deliver it. Well, what does that do? That puts your absentee ballot in the hands of party activists, political consultants, and people who have a stake in the outcome and who have every incentive to throw out your ballot if you voted for the wrong person or forge or change the outcome. Alien voting I've talked about. Ranked choice voting, this is being pushed now all over the country. And so is the National Popular Vote Plan, which they're going to talk about to get rid of our electoral college. If you want information, I've written a paper at the Heritage Foundation on every single one of these and why they're bad. So I would urge you to go to the site and you can get more. And that's my contact information. You are welcome to call me, send me an email, and I'm happy to talk. But the point is, you should be talking to your county election officials and state legislators, on the one hand, to make sure they're pushing things like voter ID, and on the other hand, that they are not putting in things like ranked choice voting, automatic voter registration, and all the things that the left is pushing in order to make it easier to commit fraud. Thanks.
I'm going to press, before Trent starts, I'm going to press the pause button and say there are action steps coming out of the first two presentations. There will be action steps coming out of the next two. I want to underscore a couple of things. Engagement and education in terms of poll workers, poll worker recruitment. It is at the precinct level is very, very important. What Hans just told us was that get out the vote efforts will push in some key battleground states, push vote totals into what is called, what I labeled in 2004, the margin of litigation. and that's what they want to do. They want to make it so close that they can litigate it. And then they put all of those resources against, so we have to, in fact, mobilize and recruit and fund a frontline group of lawyers to do our battle when we have situations that are within the margin of litigation. And then Hans talked about advocating for government issue voter ID to help protect the integrity. That in itself, it won't solve all our problems, but it's a good start. Trent?
Thanks, Ken. I'm so thankful for the work that Catherine and Hans do on all this. I was thinking about, I think I did my first poll watching in 1994 when I was a teenager, back when Washington State still had polls. And if you're from Washington or Oregon or California and you've been around that period of time, you'll remember that Republicans were competitive in all of those states in the 1990s. This isn't that long ago. And what happened since then, right? It wasn't just that, a bunch of Californians moved up to Oregon and Washington, which was a bad thing. But, sorry if you're a Californian, but it was that they changed these laws and they enacted some of the policies that Hans just talked about. And ever since they've gone to vote by mail, somebody told me this, I haven't done the research for myself, but I don't think a single Republican has won statewide in Oregon or Washington since they went to vote by mail. And I don't think that Republicans have, Republicans have done much worse in legislative elections in those states, right? These things matter a lot. And as I talked about earlier on the general session, the next step for the left is to federalize all of this, right? To get rid of the Electoral College and create a situation where they're not fighting. All those groups that Hans listed out, and it is, the playing field here is so imbalanced. When National Popular Vote launched, they launched with a $44 million war chest, right? For one niche issue on the left. right? Jonathan Soros wrote a $2 million check. John Koza, who lives up in the Bay Area, who's a big donor to Nancy Pelosi, he put in $12 million. And another guy pledged $30 million. That was just at the beginning of all this. And it is absolutely the right thing for the left to do, right? I mean, it makes perfect sense. If you are looking at things from their perspective and you want to win elections and make sure that the right can never win elections in any closed state, I mean, those are the policies that you push for. And national popular vote is the way to take all of those things national. Now, we're supposed to talk about action steps. So I want to talk about where we are right now and what we need to do. We won in the Virginia state legislature against national popular vote. It's state-based legislation, right? And kind of the theme running through all this, right, is all this is granular. Most of these issues are not federal issues. They're issues at the local level or, in the case of national popular vote, at the state level. And so this is a state-by-state fight. It happens in state capitals. We have stopped them in Virginia for this year, and there are a few other national popular vote bills pending in other places, but I think we've got a handle on those. The fight this year is two things. One is Colorado. This is going to be on the ballot in Colorado. This is the first time that the national popular vote measure has ever faced a popular vote. Right? This is a huge moment. It's either going to be a huge moment for them, or it's going to be a huge moment for us. And the polling right now shows this is a 50-50 issue. Now, if you're in the nuts and bolts of these things, the vote that we need voters to cast in Colorado is a no. No, don't enact national popular vote. So 50-50 is a great place for us to be, but the other side is pouring money into California. I mean, $200,000, $300,000, $500,000 checks, most of them coming from San Francisco, a few of them coming from New York. We've already been making some hay over the fact that only about 1% of the money that National Popular Vote is spending in Colorado is coming from Colorado. That's helpful, but our side, the campaign there that I'm working with closely, has not been able to muster nearly the resources, right? I mean, if the election were held a month from now, they would get destroyed because we don't have the money to fight this in Colorado yet. I think we're going to get there, but that is the biggest fight this year. That will tee up every state legislative fight in 2021. None of us know exactly what's going to happen in the election. It is entirely possible that Donald Trump could win. He could lose the popular vote, right? The left has kind of figured this out in 2016, right? If they think they're going to lose, they will at least try to spike the returns in a few of their deep blue cities to try to win the popular vote and keep this issue going for them. And it's also entirely possible that Republicans will not do well in state legislative elections, right? So all of these things are possible. I think 2021 is going to be a huge fight on this, and Colorado will tee this up one way or the other. The other thing is educating the public. We have a window, and I'm actually bringing the producer of a film that we're working on to the reception at 5 o'clock. Americans are going to be asking the question over the next 6 months, what is the Electoral College? And should we have an Electoral College? The other side is working on a number of strategies, including a couple of films on their side, to try to answer that question their way. We have a better story to tell. Telling the truth is always an advantage if you can actually get out there and do it. So we're working on that strategy as well. We have to educate Americans about the fact that the Electoral College is, everything we talked about earlier. It's one of the primary reasons why our country has been stable and successful for over 200 years.
Let me underscore something what Trent just said. They are using this issue as a base-driving issue to get out there. So on the one hand, long term, it's transformational as far as they're concerned. It would transform our constitutional republic into a populist, socialist-oriented sort of structure. The other thing that's important is that they really are looking at it as a base driver to get out their base. We saw this effect on our side in 2004 when we had 11 states with the marriage amendment on the ballot. It drove out our base, and some we didn't get it in some constitutions, but it drove out our base. But we got it in other states where we won both the constitutional amendment and we drove out our vote. We watched it with George Bush in 2004. George Bush in Ohio, where that was on the ballot, he got 18% of the black vote. Across the country, he got 11%. That was a driver to turn out his vote. And so I just want to make sure that we understand that we have every incentive to look at it long term, but also short term in terms of getting out the vote.
Okay, well, I appreciate everybody coming out to this session in part because conservatives have seemed to have a difficult time understanding the importance of process over the years. Conservatives are interested in the substance of public policy, but I believe it was Stalin who said, it's not who votes or how people vote, it's who counts the votes. Or as longtime Congressman John Dingell said, I'll let you write the substance, you let me write the rules, and I'll beat you every time. Right? These process issues matter enormously. I'm going to focus on something a little different, which happens primarily before the voting and the counting, and that is the process as it relates to, again, what we can talk about and how we can campaign. When I first started coming to CNP years ago, we would spend more time talking about something like campaign finance than something like voter fraud or voter integrity. And we don't do that so much anymore. And part of the reason for that, to be honest, is that we've won a lot of the worst campaign finance battles. We've done pretty well, and the left has shifted into other areas. But there are still these kinds of speech issues where they would like to silence us. And remember, conservatives rely much more on paid media than the left does, right? Because the left has the media, they can say get free media, right? And one thing that does is that our ads tend to be much more effective, not only because I think they're better on substance, but also because you can turn on the news anytime and hear the standard Democratic talking points or left-wing talking points. So it's very important that we maintain access to free media and to speaking. And there are a few ways in which those are under attack right now in Congress. One is a piece of legislation called the Disclose Act. This has been introduced for many years. The effort of Disclose is to force companies and others to disclose contributions they make to organizations such as CNP Action or anything like that, which are not publicly disclosed at this point in time, with the idea that they can then try to name and shame groups, force groups out, and they'll get the media echo behind them, and companies all retreat at any sign of controversy and try to run away from it. A second bad piece of legislation is something called the Honest Ads Act. This is Senate Bill 1356 and part of House Bill 1. Honest ads would make it very difficult to do advertising on the internet. Now, again, most people on the right think the internet's very left-wing, right? Well, if you think about it, if you think the internet's very left-wing, then the only way we get a presence on the internet is by paid advertising. And this is an effort to make paid advertising so complex that, in fact, companies will not take it. And a couple of states, Washington State, Maryland, passed this kind of legislation, and Google and others just quit taking any political ads. It's just too complicated for them to do. They'd love to have that nationally so that the only presence on the left is the non-paid, or the only presence on the internet is the non-paid, more left presence. A third piece of legislation is something called H.R. 5929, the Shareholder Political Transparency Act. This law, if enacted, and is coming up for a hearing in the House this month, would require publicly traded companies to report to the Securities and Exchange Commission any, quote, political spending they do, which would include dues to trade associations, to think tanks, and so on. Now, what's interesting about corporate America is they're kind of unreliable allies of conservatives. On certain things, they're really bad, but on a lot of the economic things, they're pretty good. And mainly when they're good, it's because they're working through think tanks and trade associations. Why? Because they don't have to be directly associated with it. If they go out and they run an ad saying, we don't agree with Colin Kaepernick or something like that, that everything comes down on them. But if they give to a trade association, the trade association promotes free enterprise, the company is spared the opprobrium of the socialist Twitter bobs and so on. So the goal here, since the FEC won't regulate this, is to say to the SEC, well, why don't you do it? You regulate corporations. Why don't you force them to disclose this stuff publicly? When this is presented to shareholders and publicly traded corporations, they vote against it over and over and over. The shareholders know this probably isn't good for the company. Moreover, they're not really interested in getting that information. They trust management to do what's best in the company's interest in this case. The left wants to force this out so they can then attack these groups. And they can say any group that's given to, they can pick anything that some organization favors, that some block of voters might dislike, and try to tie the company to it and force them out. So all of those are problems. The other thing that we need to worry about is less co-ed at this point, but these are attacks on what is sometimes called fake news. The left is absolutely furious with Facebook because Mark or Mark Zuckerberg says, I'm not going to police this stuff. People can say what they want on Facebook. Now, Zuckerberg isn't one of us, but he has honestly come to the conclusion that the kind of company he wants and the social network he wants relies on people being able to say and do what they want. And in that respect, he's become an invaluable ally in the tech community. So I got to wrap up with a couple quick action points. Opposition to those bills would always be one. But I'm going to, having said all that, talking about the speech element, I do want to raise a couple other points. One, lawyers should get poll training and training on election day activity. The best place to get that is from a partisan organization. It's called the Republican National Lawyers Commission or Association. One can look it up. If you're a lawyer, do that. If you're not, do the poll worker training. So in this case, I'm kind of doubling up on Catherine's point. We need poll workers and we need good ones. And the state will usually pay you a little bit of money and it's kind of fun. And then I want to add one other thing to Hans's long list, which is we need to fight. If we're going to have voting laws and easy absentee balloting, we need to fight these laws like California has that says it only needs to be postmarked on the day of the election. By that time, they know how many votes they need. They can read the polls coming in, the exit polls from voters and so on. You've got to say at least that it has to be postmarked, say, a week before the election, 3 days, 5 days before the election. Just postmark. So if the Postal Service screws it up and it's late, that's okay. The vote will still count. But it's got to be postmarked. If we're going to have ballot harvesting and easy mail-in balloting, which is major sources of fraud, at least don't let them know how many fraudulent votes they need before election day. So that would be the other thing I'd stress. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go into a question and answer session. This is how this will work. A question will come from the audience. It will go down. Countdown from a minute. You have a minute to make your statement, ask your question. The panelist who responds has 3 minutes to answer. You don't have to use the entire 3 minutes, but you have the 3 minutes to answer. And we're going to do this in about 30 minutes, and then we'll start to concretize the action steps. Raise your hands high. We have Morton, cousin Blackwell is first.
I'm Morton Blackwell. Not everybody in this room knows it, but I've been a member of the Republican National Committee now for 32 years, and I'm unopposed for re-election. Decades ago, there was a lawsuit in which the Republican National Committee was involved, and the chairman of the Republican National Committee, who is not remembered fondly for having done this, signed what was called a consent decree, in which the Republican National Committee agreed that they would do essentially nothing with respect to ballot security. Democrats didn't have this. The major aspects of ballot security fell then to the organization that Brad mentioned, the National Republican Lawyers Association, and they did a lot of work, but there was constant complaining that the RNC, which has a lot more resources than the National Republican Lawyers Association, couldn't weigh in. As I understand it, eventually, just not long ago,
Right.
This consent decree was voided, and the Republican National Committee now has unrestricted authority to weigh in on ballot security operations. My question is, since that consent decree has been discontinued, have you noticed resources coming from the Republican National Committee that have been well-directed in ballot security? And if not, maybe I can help prod them into doing something.
The answer to that is no.
I'll second that answer.
I mean, and I will add, that consent decree was one of the dumbest things that they ever did. And it finally ended, the judge, the senior judge who did that 30 years ago finally died. And it was assigned to a new judge, and the new judge agreed to finally end the consent decree. But I'm not aware, I don't know if you all are, that they've been doing anything with trying to make sure that we have a secure election.
Hands up, please.
There is something that could be done. Let's write it up. I can write to my fellow members of the RNC and get resources directed to this.
Okay. Here, and then here. Here.
Yeah, Jack Park. One action item. In your news troll, you find a report of vote fraud, a conviction, an allegation. Send it to Hans.
Yes, please.
That's a good word.
Question about the Supreme Court has granted a case on so-called elector.
Faithless elector.
Faithless elector.
Right.
What is the nature of the elector's obligation to the voters?
Sure. So they granted two cases, one out of Washington State, out of the Washington State Supreme Court, one out of Colorado in the 10th Circuit. The cases had went basically opposite directions on whether states can bind their electors to vote for their party's own nominee. So, of course, electors are partisan elected officials, and you had these, both of those states went for Hillary Clinton. You had these Hillary Clinton electors who said, we're going to cast votes for John Kasich or for somebody else and try to entice Trump electors to not vote for Donald Trump, which obviously it didn't work. This is most faithless electors. That's what's going on, right? It's some kind of, it's almost always the losers. It's some kind of effort to make a statement or to try to get somebody else to do something, which is why these cases, in my opinion, are mostly a tempest in a teapot, right? Faithless electors are extremely rare, and they're almost always on the losing side. And the question in these cases is, can states have these laws that bind their electors to vote for their party's nominee? Now, it's really important in the debate about the national popular vote to understand that would change how electors are selected. So that's a totally different area of law, because I get this question all the time, right? People say, well, would these cases affect the national popular vote debate one way or the other? The national popular vote is about the laws about how electors are selected. These cases before the Supreme Court that'll be argued in April and decided in June are about whether electors can be directed. And those are they're separate statutes in almost every state. They're separate issues. But what the left is trying to do, and the media, Brad said, right? The media, I repeat myself when I said the left and the media. They're trying to convince Americans that if the Supreme Court rules that states cannot bind electors to vote for their party's nominee, it's going to throw the system into chaos. And you're going to have this cabal of electors choosing the president. Most states not that long ago didn't have laws that bound their electors, right? Has anybody in this room been a presidential elector? Okay. I mean, oftentimes in a room like this, you get a couple of hands, right? I mean, electors are partisans who in almost every case are going to vote for their party's nominee. So the other side is they're going to try to use the outcome of this case, which probably will be that electors can't be bound. I think that's, if you go back to the founders' intent here, it's pretty clear that was their intent. It's a tempest in a teapot, but it is probably going to be a distraction. It's going to be something the other side is going to use to try to undermine the whole idea of the Electoral College and really lie to people and claim that there's, that this isn't, this is some kind of a cabal. And you'll hear that from people, especially on social media. That, the Electoral College is some shadowy group that selects the president. So that's what's going on there.
Just so people know, in Washington State, they fined the elector $1,000. And the Washington State Supreme Court said they could do that. Okay. In Colorado, the Secretary of State, when he discovered the elector had not voted the way he had pledged, canceled him being an elector, voided his vote. So, and the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals said, you can't do that. So that's why we got two cases with kind of opposite views before the Supreme Court.
Yes, sir. No. Here, he has the mic.
In the event that the Republicans win the trifecta, keep the White House, keep the Senate, and win back the House, and Trump wins again, is it constitutionally legal or illegal for the federal government to pass a law for federal elections only, that they follow certain guidelines universally, like requiring voter ID and paper ballot. Would that be constitutional or not?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And what you have to understand about the Constitution is that the framers of the Constitution divided up responsibility for federal elections between the states and the feds. And what they said was Congress can set the time, place, and manner of elections, but the states are responsible for the qualifications of electors. So in other words, the Congress can't pass a law that says only people who are 21 years and over can vote. They can't do that. The states determine qualifications. So it depends on what the requirement is and whether it falls into the qualifications or whether it's a time, place, and manner. And sometimes that's kind of a gray line.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I actually think the answer is yes. Now, as Hans says, not on who can vote, but in part because the court has been very liberal in determining time, place, and manner. For example, that's the basic notion behind upholding things like campaign finance laws, which aren't really about the election at all. If you think about it, it's what people talk about and say up to the election. So I think that Congress could, I think it would be contested for sure, but I think in the end they could pass a law saying, voting must be done in this particular fashion on this particular day. Already Congress, the reason every state selects its congressmen by single-member districts, one congressman represents one district, no state has like an at-large election for its 5 congressmen, it's because Congress passed a law on that way back in the 19th century. And so there is quite a bit of leeway, I think, for Congress, if we were to promote that idea of here is how the voting must take place. But Hans is absolutely right. We can't tell the states who can vote, and apportionment may also clearly fall to the states, how states are apportioned. But the question of how the election is conducted, and it would only be for federal elections, but I think the implication, I think you know what you're doing, Colin, is the implication is once the states are doing that for federal elections, they're not going to run 2 election systems. They're going to follow it for everything.
Go ahead. And then him, and then her. You got to look behind you.
Okay. So I'll be quick. What Catherine said about the need to work together, I think, is probably one of the most important things said today. And working together has to mean not just at the federal level, but with the state. Election Integrity Project California has documented and proven that California elections are, in fact, being manipulated, and the transformation of the state was not by the vote of the people. We are being manipulated right now. We bought VoteCal 3 weeks ago. Our data analysts have just started running the data. We got an alert just this morning that already with the ballots being turned in, that we have 2 counties where vote-by-mail ballots have been turned in the name of someone else. Now, we know in 2018 that thousands called through to EIPCA and said that they went to vote and were told that they had already voted with a vote-by-mail ballot. The fact is they never received that vote-by-mail ballot. This is in the process of happening right now, but our documentation sits on a shelf collecting dust unless law enforcement takes it or an attorney takes it or legislators take it. So my question is, what do we do with 10 years of proof of what's happening to California if no one will take the evidence?
Anybody want to take a step?
I'll speak. First of all, I'll echo what you said. I mean, I'm from Texas. Early election starts. We start getting phones melting that people are showing up to vote and their names aren't in the poll book. They have all the proper identification, but their names aren't in the poll book. Why is that? As it turns out, the Harris County election administrator, and Harris County, by the way, is the 2nd largest voting block in the nation, so this is not a small area, just so happened to point the database, the wrong database, to the electronic poll book, therefore filling out the electronic poll book with names that may or may not be accurate. Those things happen, but unless there's a clear contingency plan, what do? And what the state chose to do was cover it up. So you're not going to read about it. Then, to your point about absentee ballots, we had a vendor who sent out, they were a spin-off of the ES&S company called C-Change. C-Change had contracts with small counties across Texas to issue the mail-in ballots. Whoops, they sent 2 to everybody. Whoops, what's the contingency there? So to your point, what do you do with those types of things, particularly when you're not going to get any exposure, to at least notify the people to be on tap? I wholeheartedly agree with Ken's suggestion that there needs to be a go-to band of attorneys who are ready to rock and roll, who know what's happening, and that you can say, this is, if we have the empirical evidence to prove it, we have to move fast. What can we do? Yeah, what can we do? Right, what can we do? And as far as what you have right now, I don't know. Maybe the Republican National Lawyers Association, maybe Hans has some ideas, I don't know. But it's a valid question, because you know, just like I do, that feeling when you see stuff happening and you think, where do I go? Activating people, as you guys do so successfully here in California, is a huge step forward. But we have to have someone to be able to pass the baton off to, because of the New Jersey consent decree, we are rusty. We are rusty in that pass off of the baton, and we've got to get better at it, because believe you me, the other side, that's a well-oiled machine.
Anybody else want to?
The only thing I would say about this is that one of my deepest frustrations is the fact that all too often local prosecutors just have no interest in prosecuting these cases. So true. During the Obama administration, the U.S. attorneys across the country had no interest in prosecuting these cases. So right now, you've actually got an administration who is interested in prosecuting these cases. And if you have evidence of voter fraud, you should contact the U.S. attorney for this area and go talk to them. Right now, the U.S. attorney in North Carolina, in one of the districts there, great guy, is just finishing prosecuting 19 aliens for registering and voting. That is the first time that's been done in years, even though there are cases like that all over the country. So try the U.S. attorney.
Okay. Okay. We have an order going now, so you all, between the two, you all decide which way you want to go. Okay. Okay.
We'd be two nations right now if it wasn't for Abraham Lincoln, who lost the popular vote. Very few Americans know that. Critical point to make.
Well, he won a plurality.
He won the popular.
He won by electoral college.
No, he won a plurality. He had a plurality. He had 39%. Out of the four candidates who were running, he had the largest popular vote, but he didn't have a majority. That's true.
He didn't have the majority. That's an important point to make for Americans to realize how this could have impacted our country. Senator McGovern won by 120 votes in South Dakota on a recount. Senator Daschle won by 26 votes in a recount. Both recounts were on the reservation. They said that votes fell off a pickup. And Murkowski, who lost the primary, ran as an independent, won the vote with the Eskimo vote there. Senator Bethune, who lost to a lightweight like Johnson by 500 votes, the last vote counted, was on Shannon County, another reservation. Next election, he hired hundreds of lawyers to follow. They got in pickup trucks, went and voted on another reservation. They could vote with two different names, no accountability. The lawyers protected that vote. But think of the impact Senator McGovern, Senator Daschle had on our country in recounts that nobody held accountable. The Wall Street Journal is the only one that wrote an article about the voter fraud, but nobody wanted to be accused of being a racist or a bigot.
Right.
And this is what's happening all over the country. So what action steps can be taken to address this issue besides hiring lawyers, I guess, to follow some of these votes in small states where they have such a huge impact?
Well, you've got to lawyer up, and I think what Catherine mentioned about trying to recruit former first responders, and I mean, one of the problems is if you're the average Republican poll watcher, or me when I was a teenage kid doing this, do you want to go into an inner city precinct or a tribal precinct and be the Republican there to oversee things? I mean, that is not a comfortable place to be, and that's where this fraud happens. So yeah, I mean, you've got to lawyer up, but we also have to find people who are really capable.
And I echo that. I mean, it's all part of a piece, and so to be able to say, here are here are groups that are activating people to go work in the polls, and we would always say, go in groups of 2 or 3. No, go alone, because when you see something, you're all by yourself. What can you do? So there's some strategy, some on-the-ground strategy, but that's one part. Of course, there's all kinds of things that are happening prior to that we all should be involved in. But that, as I alluded to earlier, that ability to work together and pass the baton all the way to when stuff does go down, and now it's in the hands of an attorney, to be able to have a network of media outlets, it pales in comparison to what the left is doing. But at least there's a strategy that we know, okay, this happened, here's the path to try to pierce that noise with a real signal, and get some supernatural breaks along the way, but working together, I would say.
And some of us have to make sure that we take our vitamins. The mean age of poll workers is 62 in this country. And so we have to take our vitamins and muscle up.
Muscle up. That's it.
Hi. On the Electoral College, I had 2 points. One, the national popular vote. The problem is, of course, their effort to get Republicans to come on board, and because the Democrats are completely on board. Well, the Republican National Committee, when I was on it, we passed several resolutions condemning and opposing the national popular vote, and developed a pretty good record that is available from the RNC for you all to use with your Republican members if you face this problem. Secondly, regarding the Electoral College, I think there's more to this strategy of resurrecting the idea that the electors can vote however they want. I think the left pursued that in 2016 as a short-term strategy to attack Trump. That is true. But their actual long-term strategy, which is why we're in the Supreme Court now on the cases mentioned, is that if an election were ever overturned by an elector that switched sides, it would be the end of the Electoral College, and they know that. So there's a long-term strategy here to create chaos and also in the Electoral College, and also to undermine the people's faith in the Electoral College by them realizing that your votes don't matter, the electors can do whatever they want. I don't remember what you said, Trent, but I do believe that the Supreme Court will uphold the laws requiring electors to vote in accordance with the will of the people. And I would urge you all to consider passage of these laws in your own state. The best model for that is the Uniform Law Commissions, which is a bipartisan state-appointed group that I'm a member of, that adopted a uniform law for ensuring faithful electors. It's similar in effect to how Colorado's works, but it provides for that kind of procedure explicitly. And this is a good safeguard against this problem, this attack on the Electoral College.
Thanks, Jim.
Hey, Bridget Wagner. In addition to November's election, this spring there is going to be a census. Mm-hmm. And the census count is used for reapportionment and redistricting. And we all know that the left is all over the census, and their organizations and activist groups on the ground are working very closely with the census to turn out the count. They call it Get Out the Count, just like their Get Out the Vote. They have partnered with a bunch of social media organizations and tech companies, and there are some good guys in the census who are political appointees, just a handful, who are reaching out to organizations on the right, trying to get them to partner and trying to get volunteers or people who will be hired to help them complete the count. The rural areas, and they say the Libertarian West, are the most undercounted. And the census people recognize that there are undercounts, and this affects how we are represented, who is in the legislature and defending our Second Amendment rights, our First Amendment rights, our religious freedoms. So I would encourage you all to watch what's going on in the census in your communities, encourage organizations that you are working with to actually step up and partner and help and get people to sign up to be census workers.
Okay, thank you. And that's why it's so important that we realize the whole subsidiary effect. This goes down to the maybe precinct level, and state legislative districts, state legislatures draw maps.
Wait, can I say something about this before we go?
And then here.
Because this is an important point, participation in the census. But here's something else that you all need to look into and make sure you convince your state legislatures on this issue. Okay? Up until now, state legislatures, including places like Texas, when they are doing redistricting, remember, we're going to have a census, then state legislatures are going to draw new boundary lines for state legislative districts and congressional districts. Okay? Up until now, states have always used total population numbers to draw new boundary lines. And if you live in a state like Texas, Alabama, Georgia, you need to tell your state legislators you'd better switch to using citizen population when you are drawing districts. And the reason for that is that it is totally, fundamentally unfair to include non-citizens when you are drawing lines. If you want to know what the difference is, if you go someplace like Alabama, 98% of the people in a congressional district are U.S. citizens. In Los Angeles, there are 2 congressional districts that are only 40% citizens. And what folks on the left do is they use those non-citizens to be able to pad districts so they can have more congressional districts. So it's very important that you talk your state legislators into switching to using citizen population, not total population.
Well, and here's the irony in that. They do, all the talk about slavery, right? What did slave owners want at the Constitutional Convention, right? They didn't want to not count slaves. They wanted to count enslaved people as a whole person because they wanted to do exactly what modern Democrats do with illegal aliens in their own congressional districts today.
That's right.
Right? It's exactly the same strategy.
We're going here, and then we're going back here, and then we're going to beat that buzzer. Okay?
I think the best argument against the national popular vote is that it would make our presidential election a total mess. Yeah. How do you certify what the national popular vote is after an election?
No, the way the compact reads, it says you would take the totals from state certificates of ascertainment, which is a document defined by federal law. And by a very vague federal law, by the way, as Tara sort of alluded to, there are things that states can do, and just even the conversation about federal elections and what the federal government can and can't do, states have all kinds of flexibility. And it's only in the modern, in modern America where states have mostly kind of started doing it the same way. They would take the certificates of ascertainment, try to get them from every state, add them up and say, this is what the popular vote compact says. Well, it would be, this is where the federal law is vague. It says that states are supposed to provide those as soon as possible. And they have to provide those before the Electoral College votes. Now, there's a question whether that federal law is even constitutional because, states don't have to hold a popular vote at all to determine who their electors are, right? But yeah, it's not, this is where most Americans have this idea because there's a ticker on CNN, right? It's like, oh, well, everybody knows what the popular vote total is, but you flip through the different networks and the ticker says different things, right? And the certificate of ascertainment for New York in, I think it was in 16 that we had Hurricane Sandy, was missing over 200,000 votes. Right? These documents are not always correct, especially, so right now, right, New York, you get to a certain point counting the votes in New York, and you can say Hillary Clinton's going to win New York, right? Because the votes outstanding, there may be hundreds of thousands of votes outstanding, but her margin is such that you know for sure she's going to win. Well, at that point, they can certify the election for Hillary Clinton. But imagine you're trying to aggregate all of those votes, right? Well, then you don't know. And to Brad's point about ballots being postmarked on election day, theoretically, right, and the left knowing how many votes they need to cheat. Imagine a situation where you have all of these states still counting, and it's only states on the left that have these really lax laws. So you have a presidential election, the votes are coming in, you know it's going to be tight. Some states are almost done counting. Some states still have millions of votes outstanding collectively. The biggest states, California, New York in particular, right, may be the only states that have enough votes outstanding where they could sway the election one way or the other, right? And like you say, it's just chaos. This is why there's a election law professor who's a hardcore Democrat. Who he opposes this. He doesn't like the Electoral College, but he opposes national popular vote because he says it would just be a disaster for our country.
We're closing it out.
I can't believe I get the closing argument. But, we've been focused on the national vote, and obviously we all want President Trump to win and win the national vote. But it's very clear from all the comments and all the suggestions up front that really when it comes down to is the states and the state legislators. And I think this is an action session where we're looking for what we can do. And I will say that at ALEC, which is the organization for the state legislators, we've already kind of looked at some of these things. I'm happy to say that we passed the Electoral College model resolution and policy at ALEC to make sure there's no confusion among conservative legislators around national popular vote and Electoral College. In fact, Ray Haynes was an old ALEC chairman, so the very guy that's leading the national popular vote is kind of using the leverage of having been a conservative in California, and I know there are not a lot of those, to try to confuse legislators across the country. So an action item there on the Electoral College is to make sure that if you know your legislators in your state, which I hope you do, that you're communicating to them that you support the Electoral College and that did you know that ALEC has a model policy on that. In terms of the process issues that I think Hans and Brad spoke about so eloquently, that's another thing that we're doing. We're working with Hans and Brad and Cleta Mitchell, who I know you all know, on trying to identify what are those action items that legislators can take in their states. And I think we've identified a few. They can write a letter to the Secretary of State questioning the validity of an election and saying what did happen that night. So we are drafting a lot of those things. If you have ideas in that area, let us know, and we'll get those to the state legislators, and they can start to kind of exercise their political muscle in that area.
Thank you, Jamel. That's a great point on which to close. Hey,
Wow.
I'm good.
Well played, Mr. Blackwell.
All right, take a look at the list. Ultimately, we will vote for the top three, and Anna will tell us how we get to the website and register our vote. But anybody want to make an argument that she missed something, or something up there is not relevant? We have 10 minutes for this session.
Just a suggestion, encourage everybody who sees in their news troll every morning. Encourage everybody who sees in their news troll every morning a report of a vote fraud conviction, a vote fraud allegation, send it to Hans so we can include it in the database.
Okay.
And to Lisa's point, I mean, conservatives, the strategy that National Popular Vote is using is to try to confuse and divide conservatives. So, every conservative organization, everybody with a conservative voice to pick up that ALEC resolution. CAP had a great memo that went around a couple weeks ago. The RNC platform from 2016 is excellent on this. And so picking up all those things and distributing those and making this, conservatives aren't divided on this. It's like 3 people, right, who are paid shills for NPV.
Here's the action step. Let's make sure that that's a plank in the RNC platform.
That's good. That's
Okay.
good.
Oh, excuse me. Right here, and then Morton.
Well, Ken, I'll be within my minute. First of all, I want to say happy birthday to you.
Thank you.
I hope you don't mind me doing that. And I also want to say we all owe you a debt of gratitude for the leadership that you provided in this country. And thank you so much on every critical issue, Ken. You have been in the forefront. And I want you to know we honor you and thank you for it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
The only thing I was going to add is it was part of a question, and maybe it's reflected here, but the degree to which these local communities are having people vote who they know are illegal immigrants and claiming that it's legal to do so, how far does that go? And what do we do to make sure that that kind of thing can't go beyond, in fact, it shouldn't be happening at all, but it can't go beyond that to the state elections?
I will just say that you've put your finger on her. That is a problem. And in fact, again, one of the organizations Cleta and I are engaged in has issued a series of reports on different states and all the aliens they have found voting in those states. And this problem is really illustrated by a court decision I actually wrote about. I actually have a court decision out of Florida of an alien who had gotten here from Cuba. And the feds went after, this is a reported decision, for registering and voting in Florida elections. And in the decision, it talks about how the reason she did that was that when she came out of the Duval County courthouse with her mother, there was a liberal group there registering voters, and she said to them, well, I'm not a U.S. citizen. They said, well, that doesn't matter. You can still register and vote. And so she thought it was okay. And that I could tell you that happens all the time, particularly also in California.
I let Bishop's flattery throw me off my game.
Right.
Put that into a concrete action, or let's go to a concrete action. Can you put it?
I'd like to propose that.
Okay.
In addition to number 3 here, advocate for government issue voter ID. Partner to that would be the verification of identity, residency, and citizenship. Technology exists to do that. Cold, no problem.
And states, there is a move to get states to pass citizen voting legislation that explicitly says that only citizens can vote in their states. And an example of how much we need to contact our legislators and how unserious some Republicans are about this. The Republican legislature in Oklahoma voted that legislation down.
Okay, we're putting these things in action steps, folks.
Okay.
Action steps. So let's put them in action step.
I think the point that I raised at the outset could be an action step, and that is persuade the Republican National Committee to devote significant resources to the question of ballot integrity.
Okay, all right. Could we couple that up with the platform plank? Let's couple that up with the platform plank.
I think
action, and then she hasn't had a chance in back of you. And then,
I think the average Joe six-pack doesn't understand this issue, educating people. If South Dakota were a city, we'd be the 64th largest city in America.
well, help us with an action step.
Relevant.
Help us with an action
So
step.
educating people with that movie, get it out, promote it. That's one way to reach the public.
Okay. I'm here and then.
Yeah, I just want something very practical on this action thing. And starting with number 1, you said we want, good people of integrity, Republicans being poll workers, but then how do we get our people to go poll watchers? Like, what are all the jobs you need? Because, like, for example, at Priest Life, we have a huge mailing list that we email communicate with. And I would like to be able to disseminate to our list, like, hey, wake them up and say, listen, we need you in this game now. Here's the steps to do this. And this is how you apply to be that. I mean, it would be nice if we could have that handy like this. And then we can just put it into our own lingo for our people and start sending them messages every couple of weeks.
If that is chosen, we will flush it out. But poll worker is inclusive of poll watchers.
Right. But absolutely, and there's so many other positions in which to play. And of course, every state's different. But we do have that material available, and would be glad to help provide very clear.
I think that should go out to all the members who have lists and encourage them then to disseminate among their people. Because you asked here how many people are poll watchers or whatever. No one's hand went up. Shame on us, I guess. But I don't even know how to do it.
Well, exactly. But this is
that's why local county parties and state parties are so very important. But here.
So we've trained 10,000 California citizens. We've trained 10,000 California citizens to observe what we need in terms of an action.
Okay.
Right now, we're in the process of observing. The documentation that we're documenting right now is corrupt. We have now rolled up, we have one California attorney who's taking action. So it rolls up the chain, county communicator comes up to EIPCA. We contact, what we just did today, Judge Bailey, our attorney. From here, it needs to go to federal. Action plan who can we call at the federal level to take action? Because we no longer have legislators who listen to us, or Secretary of State, or RV. We're currently sending a letter directly to the Secretary of State. We're going to send it upline to our attorney with the Department of Justice. But if we don't stop this right now, Gavin Newsom's goal is to remove all Republicans in California. He's going to do it through the primary, which Republicans tend to ignore. So action step, who can we send it to right now at the federal level?
That's going to be.
Well, the answer to that is if what the state is doing is a violation of the National Voter Registration Act, which has a provision that requires states to regularly clean up their rolls, the primary enforcer of that is the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, which right now actually has a very good person in charge of it. So besides talking to the U.S. Attorney here, if you have a case that you think would work under the NVRA, you need to call and speak directly to the Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Civil Rights Division.
That's right. We just found the data. They're not complying with the settlement agreement. So who can we call today, right now?
I would call the head of the Civil Rights Division at the U.S. Justice Department in Washington and try to get DOJ into the case.
Yeah. All right. Now, this is what we're going to do, because I want to flush this out. Look, we're going to send you to vote for the top three. Now, there's some dissatisfaction. Do you see your action step articulated up there? Yes, ma'am. You.
Me?
Uh-huh.
Well, yeah, just they have to expand that number one besides poll worker.
It might just be election workers broadly.
All the things you would rather not.
Sure.
Okay. I just want to make sure we want to make sure that things are in action step mode, because it's going to get voted on, and it will be our top three vote getters that will come out of this. And how much time do we have for this?
6 minutes.
Okay.
That's 40.
Item 3.
Expand that to say including mail-in ballots?
He said including mail-in ballots on voter ID. Yeah, okay. That's what you were...
Yes.
Okay. Aaron, over here.
In the realm of education, what about social media ready bite-sized education pieces that we can use to educate the general public, not just our people, but everybody, on what is legal and what is not legal?
Okay, well, I want to put that in action step mode. Anybody? Okay, she's going to include that too, up on top on education. All right. Anybody else?
Go back. Shouldn't you combine 1, 7, and 12 because they all have to do with the poll workers? Like
Yeah.
They all are referring to that poll worker thing. So shouldn't you take 1 through 7 and merge them as one thing?
Yeah.
Support that.
All right, great. Got it.
Actually, as a lawyer, I would just suggest that you combine number 2 and number 7. I'm sorry. You can combine number 2 and number 7 and just collapse it to fund lawyers. Because if you fund lawyers, we'll be there.
Now, let me just tell you, from a strategy standpoint, you can't, the collapsing 1, 7, and 12 will probably enhance the chances that will get picked by most people in this room and make the cut. If you separate them out, they're competing against one another. So I would find a way to artistically put them together, okay? That's my strong recommendation.
Good point.
Okay.
I think combining all those poll worker, watchers, attorneys, and then I think we've got a couple items up there about state legislators. On NPV, on election integrity. I mean, obviously, contacting your state legislator on these issues and having a relationship there. It seems like we could combine all those things together as well.
All right. Can we combine three?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
The term we often use, maybe for number one, you could consider recruit, train, and mobilize election workers, and that just sort of clarifies what you're going to do with them once you got them.
But don't you think recruit, train, and mobilize also applies to the general public, not just not just poll workers?
Oh, absolutely. Recruit, train, and mobilize election workers to serve in all kinds of parts of the electoral process. But it's every state has a different process. There are different roles. So broadly, just to get engaged.
All righty. In celebration of my 72nd birthday, we're going to wind up on time and show that us old geezers can still do it. All right? So, look, Anna, you want to tell us how we're going to get to this, to vote?
Give me 1 second, putting it in a back end of a website, and then you can go vote for it.
Okay. She's going to show us, you can vote for it before you leave, or you can vote for it up in your room, but we will report tonight. So we have early voting. That's right. Let's see your badge, your ID. I got my lawyer here.
Do you want to recount on your birthday?
All righty. We're waiting on you, Anna. All right, I know, I'm just kidding you.
While we're waiting?
Yeah.
Bring up something that always drives me crazy. With a presidential election, when the East Coast, all the polls on the East Coast close, they start calling this state, this state, and this state. How fair is that to the people in Mountain Time? It's not.
What?
Because if they see a trend, that's why Jimmy Carter lost.
I think that's it. I think that's an issue where Congress has the power to regulate time, place, and manner. I mean, I think that they ought to. Well, but see, you can't do that. That's a First Amendment problem. What you need to do is just keep the polls open later on the East Coast.
All righty.
You can't call it while they're open if you required states in Eastern Time to keep their polls open until 9
We'll
p.m.
pick this up. We'll pick this up in informal conversation. Here's how you vote, right there.
Could you prohibit state officials from releasing it?
And you can go to that website and vote now on your cell phone, your iPad.
Actually coming in, right?
Or you can vote when you get to the room.
Yeah. I wonder if you didn't get around the first.
We will report out tonight, right?
You can keep it
tomorrow night on so you have a little time, a little lead time. Thank you very much. Thank our panel for a great discussion instead of action steps.
Would that be commandeering?
I don't know, because you're not asking.